Nebraska Territory, 1873. The smoke came first. Not the lazy, drifting kind that rose from cook fires each morning, but a low brown wall of it, rolling across the horizon like something biblical and furious. By the time the men in the settlement could smell it, that particular scorched sweetness of burning bluestem grass, the fire was already moving at 40 miles an hour, pushed by a southwest wind that had been building since noon. Cedar shingles caught like paper, fences evaporated, entire rooftops became columns of orange flame in under 4 minutes. Every structure in the settlement burned that afternoon, every structure except one. One cabin sat beneath a roof made of thick prairie sod, 3 layers deep, still faintly green at the edges, roots knitted together like fingers. The fire hit it, seethed at its margins, smoldered briefly at a corner where dry grass had gathered, and then stopped. The flames found nothing to eat. The roof that the entire settlement had been mocking for the better part of 2 years simply refused to burn. The man who built it was a Czech immigrant named Tomas Dvorak. He had arrived from Moravia with a wife, 2 children, $40, and knowledge about sod construction that stretched back through his family for generations. His neighbors had thought he was stubborn to the point of stupidity. They had watched him haul sod bricks through summer heat while they finished their cedar-shingled roofs in a third of the time. They had made jokes about his cabin to each other at the general store and to his face at barn raisings. They had called him old-fashioned, slow, wasteful, and one particularly creative neighbor had called him the man building a garden on his house. When the fire was over, Tomas's cabin was the only building left with a roof on it. Every neighbor who had laughed came to stand in his doorway, asking if they could sleep on his floor. His wife Anna put extra water on the stove and said nothing that could be interpreted as gloating, which was a tremendous act of personal restraint. What did Tomas understand about fire, moisture, and the physics of burning that everyone else on that prairie dismissed as the eccentric stubbornness of a man who hadn't yet learned how things were done in America? If you value stories of practical wisdom that outlasted ridicule, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth knowing about. Tomas Dvorak arrived in Nebraska Territory in the spring of 1871, the kind of spring that tricked newcomers into thinking the Great Plains were forgiving. The buffalo grass had greened up across the rolling country west of the Platte River. The cottonwoods along the creek bottoms were leafing out in pale gold, and the sky sat enormous and benevolent overhead, blue from edge to edge without a single cloud to interrupt it. It looked like a land that wanted to be settled. It looked like the posters. He had been recruited, like thousands of other Central Europeans during this period, by railway land agents who traveled through Bohemia and Moravia with pamphlets illustrated in optimistic colors, describing Nebraska as a paradise of cheap land and gentle climate. The pamphlets were, to put it charitably, aggressively selective with the truth. They did not mention the August heat that could blister paint off a wagon box. They did not describe the prairie fires that old-timers spoke about in the same reverent, terrified tone that coastal sailors used for hurricanes. They certainly did not include any drawings of locust swarms, February blizzards, or the particular psychological effect of watching a horizon that never, under any circumstances, produced a tree large enough to provide meaningful shade. But Tomas had not come to Nebraska because of the pamphlets. He had come because his cousin Joseph had written him a letter describing 160 acres of good bottomland available under the Homestead Act, and Joseph was not the kind of man who exaggerated. By April of 1871, Tomas had filed his claim on a quarter section of mixed grass prairie 8 miles north of a small settlement that had organized itself around a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a degree of collective self-confidence that outpaced its actual infrastructure. The settlement's founding families were predominantly German and Scandinavian, with one Irish family, the Kellehers, who had arrived earliest and therefore considered themselves the senior authority on how everything ought to be done. Owen Kelleher, the patriarch, had been on this stretch of prairie since 1868 and had strong opinions about everything from crop rotation to the correct angle at which fence posts should be driven. He was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had survived 3 hard years on the plains and confused survival with expertise. When Tomas arrived with his family and began staking out the corners of his claim, Kelleher rode over to introduce himself and assess the newcomer in the particular way that frontier men assessed newcomers, by looking at his hands, his tools, his wagon, and his wife in roughly that order. "You'll want to get your cabin up before July heat sets in," Kelleher told him, leaning on his saddle horn. "Most men frame up with cottonwood logs if they can get them, or order milled lumber from town if they can afford it. Get a good stand of cedar shingles for the roof. They're light, they shed water well, and any man with a fro and a mallet can split his own if he's willing to put in the time." Tomas thanked him politely. He had been in the country for 11 days and was still constructing English sentences with some effort, but he understood the substance of the advice clearly enough. He also understood, with equal clarity, that he was not going to follow it. The disagreement wasn't born from stubbornness or cultural pride, though the settlement would later interpret it that way. It was born from knowledge that Tomas carried as practically as he carried his woodworking tools, knowledge specific to a particular kind of land and a particular kind of threat. In Moravia, where Tomas had grown up in the foothills east of Brno, the family's farm sat in a valley that was prone to fire during late summer droughts. His grandfather had described losing a hay barn to a spark from a neighbor's field in 1831, watching the thatched roof go up like a torch in under 3 minutes. His father had rebuilt that barn with stone walls and a sod-covered roof in the old Alpine style, piling the earth 2 feet deep over wooden rafters, letting the grass grow wild on top until the roof looked more like a hill than a building. That barn had stood through 2 more decades of summer fires without losing so much as a timber. Not because of luck, because wet, rooted earth doesn't burn. It absorbs heat, holds moisture in its own biology, and presents fire with nothing it can use. Tomas had not crossed an ocean and walked across half of Nebraska to then put the most flammable possible material on top of his family's shelter. Cedar shingles were wonderful things. He did not dispute that. They were light. They could be worked with basic tools. They shed rainfall efficiently, and they gave a roof a crisp, finished look that announced a man's prosperity and ambition to everyone who passed. They were also, when dry and wind-exposed, on the open prairie, approximately as fireproof as a stack of newspaper. He had seen the burned-out claims on his journey west, the blackened rectangles of foundation stones, the scorched iron hinges lying in ash, the chimneys standing alone in fields where houses had been. He had asked about them at each stop, and the answers were always some version of the same story. Fire came fast, no time to fight it, roof went first. He decided he would build differently. The decision took longer to execute than it might sound. A proper sod roof was not simply a matter of shoveling dirt onto planks and wishing it luck. Tomas had learned the construction from his father and refined his understanding over years of maintaining the old farm buildings, and he knew that the engineering had to be right, or the roof would either collapse under its own weight or leak like a sieve every time it rained. He started with the bones of the structure. Heavy cottonwood logs he spent 2 weeks hauling from the creek bottom, each one notched and stacked with the careful precision of a man who understood that the roof he was planning would be considerably heavier than anything his neighbors were building. A standard cedar shingle roof might weigh 8 to 12 pounds per square foot. Tomas's sod roof, at 3 layers deep and 4 inches per layer, was going to weigh somewhere between 25 and 35 pounds per square foot. The walls had to carry that weight without shifting. The rafters had to be heavier than convention demanded. The ridge beam had to be substantial enough that Tomas's neighbor, Heinrich Bauer, when he saw it installed, declared it the thickest piece of wood I have ever seen used for a residential structure, including the ones I built for horses. Tomas took this as a compliment, which was not how it was intended. Through May and into June of 1871, he framed the cabin walls and raised the roof structure, while his neighbors finished their own buildings and began breaking sod for crops. His pace was slower than theirs, which everyone noticed and few refrained from mentioning. The extra time he spent reinforcing his wall joints, mortising his rafter connections with the care of a furniture maker rather than a homestead carpenter, added days to a timeline that his neighbors thought was already excessive. "Kelleher's got his roof on already," said Friedrich Bauer, Heinrich's younger brother, one afternoon in late June, while stopping by to borrow a rope. Friedrich had meant it as friendly observation. It landed as the leading edge of a criticism that would grow considerably sharper over the following months. "Good for Kelleher," said Tomas, sighting down a rafter for straightness. The sod cutting began in earnest in early July, and this was the phase of construction that truly crystallized the settlement's opinion of Tomas Dvorak as a man whose relationship with common sense was, at best, occasional. Prairie sod is not just dirt with grass on it. It is a biological structure built over centuries, a dense mat of interlocked roots, big bluestem, buffalo grass, Indian grass, switchgrass, that reaches 6 to 8 inches deep and binds the soil into something that approaches the cohesion of low-grade concrete. Breaking it requires a heavy steel blade pulled by oxen, and cutting it into manageable bricks takes a steady hand with a spade and real physical endurance in July heat. The bricks that result are heavy, roughly 2 feet long by 12 inches wide by 4 inches thick, and they weigh somewhere between 15 and 25 pounds each, depending on moisture content. Tomas needed approximately 900 of them to cover his roof at the depth he intended. He cut them himself, with his son František, who was 14 and had his father's broad shoulders and his mother's complete inability to conceal what he was thinking. What František was thinking, for most of July, was that this was an extraordinary amount of work for something he was fairly sure no one else in the territory was doing. "Papa," František said one afternoon, stacking bricks while sweat ran freely down his face, "why can't we just use cedar shingles like everyone else?" "Because cedar shingles burn," Tomas said, cutting another brick with clean strokes. "The Bauer's roof doesn't burn." "Not yet," said Tomas. The sod bricks were cut and left to dry for several days before installation, a step that reduced their weight slightly while allowing the root structure to tighten further. Tomas laid them in overlapping courses, starting at the eave edge and working upward, each brick placed root side up so the living grass would continue to grow and knit the roof surface together over time. Between the second and third layers, he placed a membrane of overlapping cedar bark, one of his few concessions to local materials, to redirect any seepage that penetrated the top layer before it could reach the wooden rafters below. The whole process took nearly 6 weeks. This was 2 weeks longer than it had taken Owen Kelleher to build his entire cabin, root cellar included. Kelleher found this information impossible not to share at every social gathering for the remainder of the year. "The Czech is still on his roof," became something of a running commentary among the settlement's families, delivered with the same fondness one might extend to a neighbor's particularly slow but harmless livestock. Anna Dvorak, who had been listening to variations of this observation since July, began responding to it with a politeness so precise it had a slight edge to it, like a well-honed knife. She was a practical woman from practical stock, and while she had not initially been enthusiastic about the sod roof project, she had asked Tomas on 3 separate occasions whether he was entirely certain this was the right approach. She had made her inquiries, received his explanations, thought them over, and arrived at a position of committed support. Anyone who wanted to mock her husband's roof was going to have to get past her first, and Anna Dvorak standing her ground was not an experience people sought out voluntarily. By the end of August, the roof was done. 3 layers of sod, each brick laid with overlapping joints, the whole surface already showing a faint greenish flush, where the grass was resuming growth after the disturbance of being cut and relocated. From 30 yards away, Tomas's cabin looked like something that had grown out of the earth rather than been built on top of it. His neighbors thought it looked ridiculous. Several of them said so. The mockery during the first year had a cheerful quality to it. The settlement was young, optimism ran high, the land was producing, and people in good spirits can afford to be generous with their humor. Tomas was a good neighbor and a hard worker. Everyone acknowledged that freely. His sod roof was simply the source of considerable entertainment, in the way that any departure from convention becomes entertainment in small, isolated communities where there isn't much else to discuss. Owen Kelleher's version of events, delivered regularly at the general store, was that Tomas was a man who spent 2 months doing what any sensible person does in 2 weeks, to produce a result that any sensible person would reject in 2 minutes. He said this without particular malice. He simply believed it was accurate, and he was not a man who left accurate observations unstated. Heinrich Bauer focused his skepticism on practical objections. He worried about the weight. He had seen roofs collapse in heavy snow, and he pointed out, not incorrectly, that a sod roof in winter would accumulate additional snow weight on top of its already formidable baseline load. He calculated, with the rough arithmetic available to a farmer in 1871, that Thomas's roof during a heavy snow event might be carrying close to 50 pounds per square foot. He shared this calculation with anyone who would listen, and several who wouldn't. Friedrich Bauer's objections were more aesthetic. He found the growing grass on Tomas's roof philosophically troubling in a way he struggled to articulate but couldn't let go of. "A man's house should look like a man built it," he said once, "not like it grew there by accident." He had a point in a narrow sense. By September of 1871, Tomas's roof had produced a respectable crop of volunteer wildflowers along the south-facing slope, which Anna found charming, and Friedrich found deeply unsettling. The Irish contingent's opinion was delivered by Owen Kelleher's wife, Margaret, who had grown up in County Clare and had extensive experience with the damp, mossy roofs of rural Ireland, none of it positive. "Everything rots," she told Anna, with the confidence of someone who has watched a great many things rot. "Stone and metal excluded, everything rots. Put soil on your roof, you'll have a leaking roof, and then a rotting roof, and then no roof at all, and you'll be sleeping under the sky by your third winter." Anna Dvorak thanked her for this perspective with a warmth that made Margaret feel she had been helpful, when in fact she had simply been recorded in Anna's memory under the category of things she planned to revisit later. What the neighbors did not experience, because they had not been inside the Dvorak cabin during those first months, was the remarkable quality of the air beneath a well-constructed sod roof in summer heat. Nebraska, in August, is an exercise in pure thermal punishment. The sun hits the open prairie with an intensity that can curl dry grass in the morning hours, and conventional wood-framed cabins with cedar shingle roofs become, by mid-afternoon, something between a bread oven and a sauna. Families who could afford to were outside by noon, working in whatever shade their animals and equipment provided, because their cabins were genuinely uninhabitable during the heat of the day. The Dvorak cabin, under its 3-foot thickness of rooted earth, maintained temperatures that were, by Thomas's rough measurement, using a thermometer he'd purchased in town, 15 to 18 degrees cooler than outside during peak afternoon hours. The sod acted as a massive thermal buffer, absorbing heat slowly and releasing it equally slowly, smoothing out the wild temperature swings that made summer life in conventional structures so brutal. Anna could bake bread at noon. The children could sleep through the afternoon. The family's butter didn't melt until early July, well past the point when every other household in the settlement had given up and started storing it in the root cellar full-time. Nobody in the settlement knew this, because nobody had asked. They had formed their opinions about the sod roof based on its appearance, its construction timeline, and the self-evident absurdity of growing weeds on your house. The thermal performance was an interior fact that remained interior. The first winter brought another surprise. Nebraska winters in the early 1870s were serious enterprises, not the legendary killers of the later blizzard years, but cold enough to test any structure. The thick sod roof that had absorbed heat all summer now demonstrated the same buffering property in reverse, holding warmth inside the cabin at night with a persistence that Thomas's cast-iron stove could not have achieved alone. His firewood consumption ran roughly a third below what Kelleher and the Bauer brothers burned to maintain comparable interior temperatures. He didn't advertise this. He just recorded it in a small notebook, in Czech, with the neat handwriting of a man who considered record-keeping a form of respect for what experience was trying to teach him. The roof did not collapse under the snow. Heinrich Bauer checked on this personally, riding over after each significant snowfall with the hopeful attention of someone who has made a prediction and is waiting for the universe to confirm it. The cottonwood rafters Tomas had selected and reinforced so carefully held without protest. The walls, which Tomas had built to handle the load, didn't shift or settle. The roof sweated a little in the spring thaw, as Tomas had anticipated, and a thin trickle of moisture made its way past the cedar bark membrane in one corner. Tomas sealed it in a morning's work with clay from the creek bank. Margaret Kelleher observed that the roof had leaked and considered this vindication, despite the fact that it had leaked once, briefly, and had been repaired in less time than it took Margaret to describe the leak to all of her acquaintances. The second year brought better crops and a dry summer that should have been a warning, though no one read it that way. The summer of 1873 arrived without the usual courtesy of building gradually. By June, The creek that ran through the north end of the settlement's claims had dropped to a trickle. By July, it had stopped entirely, and cattle were being driven 4 miles to a spring that old-timers said had never run dry and was, that summer, running dry. The buffalo grass that normally stayed green through June had gone brittle by the second week of June, crunching underfoot in a way that experienced plainsmen found deeply uncomfortable. The older men in the settlement, those who had been on the plains before the homestead rush, understood what the crackling grass and the absent creek and the particular quality of the southwest wind meant when they all occurred together in July. They had seen it before. They used the word tinder a great deal. They dug fire breaks and widened the ones they'd dug before. They checked their water barrels, but the settlement had a significant core of newer families, including most of the original German and Scandinavian group, who had not yet lived through a plains wildfire and did not, in the deep, practical sense, believe in it. They knew about fires the way people know about things they've read in someone else's letter, intellectually present, viscerally absent. The drought deepened through July into August. The corn that hadn't already failed stood yellow and desiccated in fields that looked like old receipts. The sky developed a particular white haze by midday, the kind of overexposed glare that suggests the atmosphere itself has given up on moisture. Livestock grew thin and irritable. The Kelleher's youngest cow dried up early, which Owen took as a personal affront, and the cow took as a meteorological inevitability. Tomas spent 2 days in early August walking the perimeter of his claim with a spade, extending and deepening the firebreak he'd scratched in the previous year. He turned the sod in a strip 12 feet wide on the southwest and west faces of his property, exposing bare earth that fire could find no footing on. Then, he wetted down the strip from a barrel he'd been filling each morning from the spring. His neighbors watched this with a mildly amused tolerance reserved for people who worry too much. "You're working harder than the fire, Dvorak," Friedrich Bauer called from the road one afternoon, watching Thomas drag a wet burlap sack along the firebreak. "One of us needs to," Thomas said, not looking up. Friedrich shook his head with the easy confidence of a man who has not yet been wrong about the thing he is about to be wrong about. He had a good firebreak already dug, he thought. He had a tight cabin with solid walls. His family would be fine. Besides, fires burned north and east on the prevailing winds, and his cabin sat on the northeast corner of his claim. He'd been told this geography was to his advantage. What Friedrich had not fully calculated was the way that a fire, moving at speed in a strong southwest wind, produces its own weather. The way heat rising off burning grass accelerates the air above it, creating turbulence that can shift wind direction locally, throwing burning embers far ahead of the main front in unpredictable trajectories. A fire moving across flat prairie is not a simple wall advancing in a straight line. It is a complicated, chaotic, living thing with flanks and fingers and airborne sparks that can travel 300 yards and land on a dry cedar shingle and ignite a new fire entirely separate from the main front. None of this was known to the men in the settlement in any formal scientific sense, but the old-timers knew it in the practical way that people know things they have survived. Several of them, if asked, would have found words for it. Nobody had asked. The fire started somewhere to the southwest on the afternoon of September 2nd, 1873, in conditions that made everything that happened afterward feel inevitable. The temperature had reached 94 degrees by noon. The wind had been building since morning, a steady southwest push that was gusting past 30 miles an hour by midday and accelerating. The grass across 10,000 acres of unbroken prairie was so dry it would have kindled from friction alone. The precise origin was never determined. A spark from a passing rail crew was the most common theory afterward, though no railroad ran close enough to make this geometrically easy. Some believed it was a cook fire from a passing family of settlers that got away from them. One account, probably apocryphal, suggested lightning, despite the fact that no one in the settlement recalled seeing a cloud that afternoon significant enough to produce it. The origin didn't matter to the people in the path of the fire. Only the direction mattered, and the speed, and those were already clear by the time the smoke became visible on the horizon. The first person in the settlement to see it was František Dvorak, now 16 and working in the family's remaining cornfield when the brown smudge appeared to the southwest at roughly 2 in the afternoon. He had grown up hearing his father talk about fire on the prairie in the specific, non-hypothetical way that men talk about things they genuinely fear and genuinely plan for. He did not spend time watching the smoke with the curious fascination that would cost some of his neighbors precious minutes. He ran for the house and shouted his father's name before he was through the door. Tomas came out, looked southwest for about 4 seconds, and turned to Anna. "Get everything you can carry into the root cellar," he said. "The children first, then the documents, then the food you can carry. Everything else stays." Anna had been married to this man for 19 years. She did not ask questions. She moved. Tomas went to his water barrels. He had 3 of them, each 50 gallons, which his neighbors had found excessive, and began soaking every piece of burlap he owned. He climbed onto his roof, which was the kind of activity that must have looked somewhat absurd to anyone watching. A man scrambling up the side of a grass-covered hill with wet rags and a bucket, and began wetting down the south-facing slope of the sod in long, sweeping strokes. The living grass held the water, releasing it slowly into the dense root matrix below. He worked the ridgeline, the north slope, the edges where dry grass from the surrounding land might bridge onto the roof surface. He had 23 minutes between the moment František saw the smoke and the moment the fire's leading edge reached the Kelleher property half a mile southwest. Owen Kelleher's cedar-shingled roof caught in the first minute of contact. The fire's advance wave, moving at close to 40 miles an hour ahead of that southwest wind, threw sparks and burning fragments 20, 30, 40 yards ahead of the main front. One of them, a piece of burning stem no larger than a man's thumb, landed in the valley of the cedar shingles, where the Kelleher's roof ridge met the west slope. The resin in the dry cedar caught immediately. By the time Owen realized his roof was on fire, which was approximately the same moment he smelled it, the west slope was already committed. He and Margaret evacuated in the 8 minutes it took the cabin to become structurally untenable. Friedrich Bauer's cabin went next, and faster. Friedrich had built with milled lumber, which gave his cabin a cleaner look than Thomas's heavy log construction and about a quarter of the fire resistance. His roof was gone in 4 minutes from first contact. The walls followed in another 12. Friedrich stood 70 yards back in the plowed earth of his east field and watched his cabin become a brief, violent column of heat and smoke, while his wife held their youngest daughter and his older children stood in a row with the stunned expressions of people experiencing something their minds don't yet have a category for. The Bauer barn, cedar shingle roof, hay inside, which is the single worst possible combination of materials from a fire perspective, went up so fast it was almost spectacular. A witness later described it as a building that appeared to skip the burning stage and proceed directly to the fully ablaze stage without any meaningful interval between them. The horses had been let out, fortunately. The winter hay supply had not. Heinrich Bauer's cabin, which sat slightly north of Friedrich's and in a slightly more sheltered position behind a low rise, had those 4 or 5 extra minutes that geography provided. Heinrich used them to get his family and his 2 milk cows onto the road heading east. He did not use them to fight the fire because there was nothing to fight it with that would have made any difference. His roof caught from a wind-driven ember the same way Kelleher's had, and the result was identical. The Kelleher root cellar survived intact, which was the tradition with root cellars, and the primary reason that more people weren't ruined completely. The earth around them absorbed the heat, but the structures above ground, the cabins, the barns, the fences, the stack of carefully split firewood that Owen Kelleher had spent 2 weeks building at the edge of his yard, were gone in under an hour. The fire moved northeast across the settlement, which is what the prevailing wind demanded. It was broad enough, perhaps a mile and a half across, that no useful amount of fire break created by any individual homesteader was going to stop its main body. What the fire breaks could do, and what Thomas's wider-than-average strip of turned sod on his southwest face did do, was prevent the fire's edge from running up to his walls and finding purchase. The fire's contact with Thomas's property lasted perhaps 12 minutes. The main front passed his west side, fanned by the southwest wind. The exposed earth of his firebreak gave it nothing. The clay-chinked cottonwood log walls gave it very little. The fire ate some dry grass that had accumulated against the base of the north wall, scorched the wood of his window frame on the west face, licked at the corners where his walls met the earth, and reached upward, and found the sod. What happens when fire reaches a well-watered, living sod roof is one of those things that is simultaneously physically obvious and visually counterintuitive if you've never seen it. The fire finds the edge of the roof and begins moving inward, the way any fire does on any surface. But a sod roof that has been watered and is alive, whose root matrix holds moisture the way a sponge holds water, gives the fire almost nothing to sustain itself. The outer edge of dry grass at the roof's perimeter scorches, blackens, retreats. But the rooted interior, 3 layers deep, 4 inches per layer, holds. The fire smolders at the margin, generating smoke, but not flame, and then stalls. The temperature inside a living sod roof during a grass fire contact event remains dramatically lower than the surface temperature because the earth itself is an insulator with enormous thermal mass. The same property that made Tomas's cabin cooler in summer and warmer in winter now prevented the heat from penetrating the roof structure and reaching the wooden rafters below. While the fire surface might reach 600 or 700 degrees Fahrenheit at the immediate point of contact, a foot into the sod, the temperature barely moved. Tomas knew none of this in these specific scientific terms. He knew it the way his father had known it and his grandfather before that. He knew it because the barn with the sod roof had survived while other structures hadn't, and he had been paying attention. He watched from the doorway of his cabin, which he'd left open to monitor, prepared to retreat to the root cellar with his family if the structure became unsafe. As the fire's edge crept 2 feet onto his south-facing slope, smoldered, generated a quantity of smoke that was alarming in appearance, but ultimately theatrical in consequence, and stopped. He could see the scorched margin clearly, a dark strip no more than 30 inches wide, where the dry volunteer grass at the roof's edge had burned and the underlying sod had not. The wooden ridge board, visible at the peak, showed no charring. The rafters below would be checked later and found identical in condition to the day they were installed. After 45 minutes, when the main fire front had passed to the northeast and the air began to clear, Tomas climbed onto the roof with the water bucket he'd never fully used and soaked the scorched margin again out of thoroughness rather than necessity. He assessed the damage. 1 window frame on the west side would need replacement. The dry grass along the base of the north wall had left a scorch mark on the bottom 2 logs that would need examination, but probably not intervention. The fire break had held on 3 sides. The sod had held on all of them. He climbed down, went inside, and told Anna and the children it was safe to come up from the root cellar. Then he put a pot of water on the stove, because he was fairly confident there were going to be visitors shortly, and that they were going to need somewhere to sit down. They came through the afternoon and into the evening, arriving in the particular shell-shocked procession of people who have just watched their preparations be revealed as insufficient. The Kellehers came first, Margaret still carrying the box of documents she'd grabbed on the way out. Owen walking with the careful gait of a man whose legs are functioning on pure stubbornness because nothing else is. Friedrich Bauer came with his family an hour later, his youngest still crying quietly against his wife Elise's shoulder. Heinrich Bauer arrived at dusk with his 2 milk cows, which he tethered to Tomas's fence post without asking, because asking would have acknowledged a level of obligation he wasn't ready to fully process. Tomas's cabin, which his neighbors had found amusingly eccentric for 2 years, was suddenly the most important building in the settlement. It had a roof, it had intact walls, it had a stove, a floor, a door that closed, a window with glass still in it. It was, at the end of that day, the only structure in the settlement that could be described without qualification as a house. 14 people slept in it that night. The children were arranged on the 2 beds and on quilts on the floor. The adults sat up against the walls. Anna Dvorak, who had been hearing variations of the opinion that her husband's construction choices were unfortunate for 24 months, made soup from the stores in the root cellar, sliced bread, and said nothing that could be interpreted as, "I told you so," which required a level of personal discipline that probably should have its own historical documentation. What she did say, quietly, to Elise Bauer while they were washing bowls near midnight was, "He worried about fire since before we came here. I thought it was too much worry. I was wrong." And Elise, whose cabin was a pile of scorched timber a mile and a half away, simply nodded and didn't say anything at all for a while. Owen Kelleher sat against the east wall of the cabin that night with the expression of complex internal weather. Owen was a proud man, and pride was performing its usual function of making a person miserable in exactly those moments when humility would serve them far better. He had been the settlement's authority on construction, on frontier practice, on the right and sensible way to build a home in this country. His roof had caught in under a minute. Dvorak's roof, which he had described on multiple occasions as an example of immigrant stubbornness badly applied, was currently above all of their heads, doing its job, having done its job, in a way that Owen's had emphatically not. He sat with this through most of the night. Near dawn, when the cabin had quieted to the sound of exhausted people sleeping wherever they'd stopped sitting, Owen got up quietly and went outside. Tomas was already there, standing at the corner of the house looking at the scorched margin of the roof in the gray early light. "It burned to the edge and stopped," Owen said. It was not quite a question. "It burned to the edge and stopped," Tomas agreed. Owen looked at the dark strip of scorched root matter along the south slope for a long time. "How thick is the sod?" he finally asked. 3 layers, 4 inches each, 12 inches total." "And how far did the fire get?" Tomas pointed to the margin, which was clearly visible now in the growing light. "About 30 inches from the edge. The wet grass below the surface. The roots. It doesn't burn. It absorbs the heat and holds it. The fire can't go further than the moisture lets it." Owen Kelleher was quiet for a while longer. When he spoke, his voice had the specific quality of a man who is saying something difficult and has decided not to make it more difficult by hedging. "My grandfather built with stone in County Cork," he said. "I thought lumber was better because it was faster and the timber was here. I didn't think about what burns." "Stone is better," Tomas agreed, not unkindly. "But we didn't have stone. We have sod." Owen nodded. There was a pause that neither man felt the need to fill. Then Owen said, "Can you show me how you built it?" "I can show all of you," Tomas said. "We have time now. We'll need to rebuild everything anyway." The cabin became the rebuilding headquarters for the settlement for the remainder of the autumn and well into winter. It functioned in this capacity with a practical efficiency that no one had planned and no one needed to formally organize, because the situation was obvious and Tomas Dvorak had built his table large enough to seat 12 people, which was either providential or simply the kind of preparation that defined his approach to everything. Within a week of the fire, Tomas had begun conducting what amounted to informal construction seminars in his yard each morning before the day's work started. He walked men through his rafter selection, how he'd chosen green cottonwood over dry, because green wood has more flex and won't crack under point loads the way dry timber does. How he'd mortised each rafter connection rather than relying on nails, because mortise joints don't pull out when load shifts. He showed them the cedar bark membrane he'd laid between the second and third sod layers, explaining how it functioned as a redirect for water infiltration rather than a complete seal. He explained the overlapping brick pattern, which staggered joints the way a bricklayer staggers courses, preventing any single seam from running continuously from eave to ridge. Friedrich Bauer took notes on the back of a flour sack because he'd lost his notebook in the fire along with everything else and had not yet replaced it, which is the kind of detail that gets remembered because it captures something true about the conditions under which knowledge sometimes gets transmitted. He asked more questions than anyone else, which was characteristic. Friedrich was a man whose skepticism had always been the energetic variety, rather than the passive kind. He mocked things he didn't understand because he was actually trying to understand them, and mockery was how he engaged with the unfamiliar. Now that the familiar had failed, and the unfamiliar had not, he wanted the details with an urgency that made Tomas grateful he'd kept his own notes in check and could provide exact measurements and material quantities without relying on memory. Heinrich Bauer's primary concern was structural. He had a background in German timber framing, had worked 2 seasons as a carpenter's apprentice in Bavaria before emigrating, and he understood load calculation in the practical way of someone who had pulled apart failed roofs to find out why they'd failed. He examined Thomas's rafter sizing, walked the ridge, pressed his palm flat against the wall plates to feel whether they'd moved under the roof's weight over 2 seasons, and arrived at the conclusion that Thomas's framing was, if anything, slightly over-engineered for the load, which was exactly what it needed to be. He said this to Thomas with the particular respect of one craftsman acknowledging another's work, and Thomas received it the same way. The sod cutting began in earnest for the rebuilding cabins in mid-September, when the ground was still warm enough to work, but the rains that sometimes came in early autumn had dampened the prairie surface enough to make the cutting easier. Thomas moved between claims, advising on rafter selection and spacing, helping judge whether a particular lot of cottonwood was straight enough for ridge use, demonstrating the bricklaying pattern on the first course of each new roof until the family felt confident to continue alone. What the settlement built that fall was not identical to Thomas's original cabin. Several families, having now experienced the fire's behavior firsthand, made modifications: thicker fire breaks, wider cleared margins around building foundations, additional water storage. The Kelleher's chose to face their replacement cabins south rather than west, a reorientation that Owen determined would give the prevailing southwest fire winds the narrowest possible face of the building to attack. He made this decision with the careful geometry of a man who has started thinking about fire the way you think about things that have personally threatened your family and your cattle and 23 years of work. By November, 4 of the 7 settlement families had replacement structures with sod roofs in progress. The other 3 had prioritized getting temporary shelter up before winter and would return to the roofing question in spring. But the conversation had fundamentally changed. Nobody was talking about cedar shingles as the obvious, self-evident, correct choice anymore. They were talking about cut depths and root density and how long to let bricks dry before laying, and what grade of slope allowed rain to shed without allowing the bricks to slip during freeze-thaw cycles. Margaret Kelleher, who had told Anna Dvorak with considerable confidence that sod roofs rot, came to ask Anna in late October how to manage the volunteer grass growth that was already appearing on their new roof. Was it better to let it grow, or trim it, or remove it entirely? Anna told her correctly that growth was desirable. It meant the root matrix was active and continuing to knit the surface together, but that grass allowed to grow too long would dry out at the tips in summer and present more combustible material than a trimmed surface would. She suggested keeping it cut to 3 or 4 inches, which was what Thomas did. Margaret listened to this with attention and wrote it down in a small book she'd purchased specifically for the purpose. If she found the experience of taking notes on sod roof management from the woman whose husband's roof she'd been predicting the imminent failure of for 2 years to be somewhat uncomfortable, she did not show it. Margaret Kelleher was, above all things, a practical woman, and practicality in the autumn of 1873 looked like listening carefully and writing things down. The winter of 1873 was harder than the 2 that preceded it, which in Nebraska was saying something. January brought temperatures that dropped to 22 below zero for a week and a half straight, the kind of cold that froze wagon wheel iron so it shattered when struck, that killed cattle in barns that didn't have adequate south-facing windows to collect even the weak winter sun. Water froze in barrels left overnight in cabins with inadequate stoves. Families who had rebuilt quickly using lightweight materials, prioritizing speed over quality after the fire, found themselves fighting cold on top of everything else. The Dvorak cabin sat through it with the characteristic thermal stubbornness of 12 inches of rooted earth. The interior temperature variations that Thomas measured in his notebook, he continued his record-keeping through this winter with the same methodical attention he'd brought to everything, showed a maximum drop to 41 degrees on the single coldest night, with the stove banked low before bed. The Kelleher family, who had a new sod roof installed but walls that were still somewhat provisional, managed 53 degrees on that same night. The families still in temporary frame shelters were considerably less comfortable. Thomas's firewood pile started that autumn with the benefit of 2 full years of accumulated reserves, lasted the entire winter, with enough left over to give Friedrich Bauer a half-cord in February when Friedrich's supply ran short. Friedrich accepted it without the easy pride that had characterized him before September, and Tomas offered it without the satisfaction of a man scoring a point. They were past that now. They were neighbors in the plain, functional sense of people who needed each other to survive, and both of them understood this in a way they perhaps hadn't before the fire. The spring of 1874 brought something Thomas had not expected and wouldn't have predicted: correspondence from other settlements asking about the sod roof construction. Word had moved through the networks that connected frontier communities, through supply traders, through the irregular mail service, through the particular telegraph system of frontier gossip that somehow managed to carry technical information alongside the social news. A homesteader 40 miles east wrote to ask about rafter sizing. A settlement organizer in central Kansas wrote to ask whether the method worked on structures larger than a cabin, barns specifically. A county agricultural agent wrote a formal letter requesting Thomas's specifications for potential inclusion in a bulletin. Thomas answered all of them in careful, measured letters that described the method with the precision of someone who had kept records and therefore had numbers to offer rather than approximations. He specified rafter dimensions relative to span width. He described the brick layering sequence with the care of someone writing instructions for a person who had never seen a sod roof and might, if the instructions were imprecise, build one that failed. He noted the importance of firebreak width relative to fire speed in various wind conditions, drawing on his own measurement of how far the September fire had thrown burning material ahead of its main front. The letters took time he didn't always have, and he wrote them in the evenings by lamplight while Anna mended, and the children did schoolwork, and the sod roof held the warmth down around all of them like a hand. The settlement rebuilt itself over the next 2 years with a thoroughness that the fire had made unavoidable. New construction was better than the original, informed by 2 years of experience and one very expensive lesson about what the word fireproof actually meant in practice versus what people assumed it meant when they chose a roofing material because it was what everyone else used. The cedar shingle roof did not disappear from the settlement immediately. It was cheap and fast, and those were real virtues that didn't vanish just because one fire had demonstrated one flaw. But it was no longer the automatic, unthinking default it had been before September of 1873. When families built new, they made conscious choices. They weighed speed against durability, cost against resilience, the particular threat profile of their specific piece of land against the general assumptions of frontier construction practice. Some chose sod, some chose cedar shingles, but combined them with wider fire breaks and better water storage. Some chose a hybrid approach, sod on the vulnerable south and west faces, cedar on the north, where wind-driven fire was less likely to approach. None of them chose anything without thinking about fire the way they had not thought about fire before. Owen Kelleher, who had been the settlement's authority on how things were done, and whose authority had been tested and found partial in September 1873, rebuilt as a different kind of authority, one who asked questions before pronouncing on the answers. He put a sod roof on his second cabin, built it with Thomas's specifications, and maintained it with the attention of someone who has learned to respect the thing he once dismissed. His second cabin stood for 31 years. His son built with sod, too, when he settled his own claim, because Owen had told him why. Friedrich Bauer's flour sack notes were eventually transferred to proper paper and shared widely enough that some version of them made it into an agricultural extension publication in 1878, attributed to a practitioner in central Nebraska, because the editor believed specific attribution added unnecessary detail. Friedrich thought this was annoying, but not worth fighting about. He was, by that point, more interested in the information spreading than in receiving credit for spreading it. Tomas kept his original notebook, with its careful Czech entries, documenting rafter calculations, sod brick weights, seasonal temperature readings, and firewood consumption. He added to it through the following years, recording how the roof's performance evolved as the grass grew denser on the surface, how the second winter's freeze-thaw cycle affected the brick seams, how the cedar bark membrane between layers eventually needed replacement, and what he used instead when he could not source cedar bark during a particular season. The notebook was less a record of triumph than a working document, the ongoing annotation of a method that worked but still deserved attention. His daughter, Marta, inherited it when she married and moved to a new claim to the north. She used it to advise her husband on their first construction, who was not Czech and had not grown up with sod construction and was initially skeptical of the extra work and weight involved. He became less skeptical after the first summer, when the interior of their cabin stayed remarkably cool during an August that sent the neighbors retreating to their root cellars to escape the heat, and considerably less skeptical after the first winter, when his firewood supply lasted into April, while his brother-in-law's ran out in February. The fire of September 1873 did what all true tests do. It revealed the difference between what people had chosen and why they had chosen it. Most of the settlement's construction decisions had been made on the basis of what was conventional, what was fast, what everyone else was doing, and what the men who had been there longest said was right. These were not unreasonable criteria. They are, in fact, the criteria most people use most of the time, and on balance they serve adequately for adequately predictable challenges. They do not serve especially well against the kind of challenge that comes from outside the range of what convention has already encountered and survived. A cedar shingle roof is a fine roof against rain and snow and age. It is not a fine roof against a grass fire moving at 40 miles an hour through dry September prairie. The people who chose cedar shingles had not made a stupid choice. They had made an incomplete one. They had solved for the threats they had seen and thought about, and not sufficiently for the one they hadn't. Tomas Dvorak had made a different calculation. He had arrived from a place that had taught him fire was a genuine and recurring threat, not a remote possibility. He had brought that knowledge with him and applied it to a material landscape that, it turned out, shared the core risk profile of what he had already learned. The sod roof was not exotic technology. It was ancient technology, applied with precision to a specific threat. Its effectiveness was not surprising to anyone who understood the physics. Its effectiveness was deeply surprising to everyone who had never thought the physics mattered. The rebuilding headquarters that operated out of his cabin through that autumn and winter was in some sense the final chapter of the story, but it was also the beginning of a different kind of legacy. Not the legacy of the man who had been right while others were wrong, that framing was too simple and too comfortable to be entirely true. Rather, it was the legacy of a method proven under pressure that could now be taught, adapted, refined, and passed along. Tomas, sitting at his table in the evenings with his notebook, and Friedrich Bauer's questions, and Kelleher's slowly rebuilding pride, and Anna's soup on the stove, and the sod roof absorbing whatever the night asked it to absorb. That was the legacy. Knowledge that had crossed an ocean in one man's memory, now resident in a Nebraska settlement, now spreading outward in letters and notes and conversations and the visible fact of surviving structures. Practical wisdom doesn't announce itself. It builds quietly over months that other people spend laughing and waits for the conditions that will demonstrate whether the preparation was right. In Nebraska Territory in 1873, the conditions arrived on a southwest wind at 40 miles per hour in a dry September afternoon, and the preparation turned out to have been exactly sufficient. The roof that grew wildflowers along its south slope and made everyone in the settlement laugh for 2 years held while the fire swept through and passed and left every other structure a memory. Sometimes the most important thing a man can know is what burns and what doesn't. If you found this story worth your time, subscribe and share it with someone who might need to hear it. We have more of these. Stories of practical wisdom that looked like stubbornness until the moment arrived that required it. They're all worth remembering.